Bill and Hillary Clinton spoke at an event in Little Rock, Ark, on Saturday, marking 25 years since Mr. Clinton's election as president. Andrea Morales for the New York Times. Little Rock, Ark. It was billed as a celebration of the 25th anniversary of the Clintons' ascension to the White House, held in some of the same haunts of the Arkansas Capitol where it all began. Yet the election that Bill and Hillary Clinton were most eager to revisit here was not Mr. Clinton's triumph of a quarter-century ago. It was the one that Mrs. Clinton lost last year, one that the Clintons, and many of their supporters, have clearly not gotten over. For the first part of a 90-minute conversation with the Clintons on Saturday moderated by James Carville, Mr. and Mrs. Clinton made all manner of references, both direct and indirect, to the man who denied their bid to reclaim the White House, Donald J. Trump. However, it was not until Mr. Clinton invoked his wife's losing campaign, proud of her for getting caught trying to put people first, he said, that her admirers rose to their feet in what was an obvious emotional release. That was the cue to Mr. Carville, the 1992 campaign maestro who now makes a living delivering speeches and can read an aunt's, that the attendees hungered for more than Clinton-Gore nostalgia. And Mrs. Clinton gave it to them. Apparently, my former opponent is obsessed with my speaking out, she said, noting that Mr. Trump had just trained his Twitter fire on her earlier in the day. Honestly, between tweeting and golfing, how does he get anything? Donnie explaining how she had tried to cope with what she called a very painful loss. She said she had taken to mystery novels because the bad guy always got it in the end. The weekend gathering was supposed to be a reunion of the first Clinton for President campaign, an exercise in escapism from the recent unpleasantness, set to the familiar chords of Fleetwood Mac's Don't Stop, which opened and closed the event. But thinking about tomorrow is all the harder when you are locked in a nasty feud that continues unabated a year after Election Day. A collage at the State House Convention Center in Little Rock. Andrea Morales for the New York Times. Hours before the discussion, Mr. Trump lobbed his latest insult at Mrs. Clinton. Crooked Hillary Clinton is the worst and biggest loser of all time, he wrote on Twitter. She just can't stop, which is so good for the Republican Party. Hillary, get on with your life and give it another try in 3 years. Mrs. Clinton, though, went well beyond ridicule in her election laments on Saturday. She inveighed against the rise of phony news, recalling how when lifelong friends of hers went canvassing, they were informed by voters that Mrs. Clinton was behind all manner of criminality, including running a child trafficking ring in the basement of a pizzeria. When her friends would push back, they would be told, "Oh yeah, I saw it on the internet," Mrs. Clinton recounted with dismay. She savaged Russia for weaponizing information, stealing information, but her critique plunged far deeper than the events of last year. She said democracy itself was under duress because avenues of communication with the electorate had been compromised. A democracy depends upon an informed citizenry that has access to accurate information, Mrs. Clinton said to Applause, imploring leaders to stand up to what she described as partisan advocacy masquerading as news. And she even appeared to recast her famous 1990 Syrah claim of a vast right-wing conspiracy working against Democrats. Our body politic's immune system has been impaired because there has been a concerted effort, starting with the creation of the Fox network, said Mrs. Clinton, pointing out that Fox News did not exist when Mr. Clinton ran in 1992. It was one of the reasons why he probably survived, she said. The talk had turned to last year's election after Mr. Carville, an hour into the discussion, acknowledged that there's an elephant in the room. But there was another one, too: the reappraisal of Mr. Clinton's treatment of women. Mrs. Clinton's reference to her husband's political survival in 1992, along with his recalling how his poll numbers had been plummeting shortly before the New Hampshire primary that year, was as close as either got to the issue. The aunts during the conversation between the Clintons and James Carville, a strategist on the 1992 campaign. Andrea Morales for the New York Times. The flood of women who have emerged to accuse prominent men in politics, entertainment and the news media of UAL predation has left some Democrats uncomfortable defending Mr. Clinton, who admitted to an extramarital affair with a young White House intern but has denied charges from other women who claim UAL misconduct. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York, a longtime Clinton ally in their adopted state, even said last week that she thought Mr. Clinton should have resigned over his affair with Monica S. Lewinsky. Questions here in Little Rock about Mr. Clinton's behavior brought evident discomfort. But it was clear that there is something of a generation gap in how he is viewed. A pair of Arkansas women in their 20s who were sitting along President Clinton Avenue, a renamed thoroughfare rejuvenated by the completion of Mr. Clinton's nearby presidential library, clutched copies of Mrs. Clinton's new book, which they had just gotten signed at an event on Saturday. The women, Autumn Dixon, a special education teacher, and Caitlin Watt, a behavioral therapist, made little attempt to defend the former president, noting that they separated Mr. Clinton and Mrs. Clinton, and resented efforts to pin his misdeeds on her. IWASNT voting for Bill Clinton. I was voting for Hillary, Ms. Dixon said. I was not a part of that election, added Ms. Watt, referring to Mr. Clinton's first White House victory. I was born in 1991, but another group of women, veterans of Mr. Clinton's White House who also attended the book signing, responded with a ferocious and unqualified defense when asked about the former president's UAL behavior. Such questions, they said, are little more than a way to distract from what they called Mr. Trump's far more serious UAL transgressions. I think it's baloney, said Jean Carter Wilson, a Tennessean who worked in presidential personnel for Mr. Clinton. I think he has done more for women and minorities and equality in this country than anybody in my lifetime. Marion Baker, 93, of Conway, UK, who started a Hillary Clinton fan club in 1993, at the event. Andrea Morales for the New York Times. When lightly pressed, she walked away in anger. Her friend and fellow former Clinton aide, Denise Ryan, was more willing to engage but no less dismissive of the claims against Mr. Clinton. It's good that we're having this conversation, but I don't think it's fair to relitigate this on President Clinton again, said Ms. Ryan, who is now a lobbyist in Washington for the Girl Scouts. Enough of that, we did it. As for Ms. Gillibrand, the Clinton loyalists seemed satisfied to let the Jeremiah de Philippe Reign, Mrs. Clinton's former press secretary, stand. Mr. Reign tweeted that Ms. Gillibrand was a hypocrite for speaking out now after taking the Clintons' endorsements, money, and seat. Can't them prove on perfection, Mr. Carville said. Mr. Clinton's accusers had their say at the time, added Paul Begala, another top official in the 1992 campaign, and the country decided they loved Bill Clinton. He added that the current dialogue was about empowering people who never had a chance to speak out, as they sipped drinks and munched on the famous canned pecans in the bar at the Capitol Hotel or put away porterhouses and tamales up the street at Desert Place, though. The Clinton alumni were far more transfixed by what one called the alternate universe of the Trump era and how to get out of it. Yet this conversation was nearly as difficult, because their own party seems to be drifting away from Clinton-style moderation and toward a more undiluted liberalism. In Mr. Clinton's own state, where Democrats still dominated as recently as a decade ago, Republicans now hold every congressional seat and every statewide office. Asked if his party could mount a comeback here, former Senator Mark Pryor, who was held below 40% in his re-election bid 3 years ago, said only, "I hope so. There is but one solution to the Democratic woes," added Rahm Emanuel of Chicago, a member of the 1992 campaign, to start thinking about tomorrow by recalling the success of yesterday. His politics, in my view, is still the only way to win, Mr. Emanuel said of Mr. Clinton.